Howdy, my name is Seth Murray. I'm a professor at Texas A&M University, and I'm the president-elect of the Crop Science Society of America, who I put this presentation for and got some interesting feedback and wanted to share it a little more broadly. So what I want to talk about is what does the future of scientific scholarship look like? From who pays for the publication and the difference between the historic models and open access models, to the cost of publishing and impact factors, to preprints and how peer review might be extended in the future, and if peer review is even all that valuable. So the first part, who pays for publications? And this is really a simplified view. But the historic model, or what I call model one, is that libraries and institutions have subscribed to journals and packages of journals. And so it was the libraries and readers pay model. This was great because it was at no or low cost to authors. So you as a scientist could write an article and get it published and it didn't cost you anything. But the work accessibility really varied by the resources in the journals. And so there's problems with that being actually freely publicly accessible, as we'll talk about a little bit later. So you can imagine that many different institutions subscribe to the broad scientific journals like Science or Nature or Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, but yet few comparatively would pay for the crop science or plant genome journal articles. So the problem with this is that readers at poor institutions or readers especially in the developing world could not afford to access these materials. Right, so we do science, and then we want that to be broadly available to everybody. But given this model, the only way that they could access that is through some type of charity, which not all publishers had. Now, if we jump down to model two, this is by far the most common model now, which is a journal that's gold tier open access. All right, and so the difference here is that for every article in that journal, the author pays, and I'm going to show you a rundown of about how much that costs. Now, the benefit of this is all work is freely accessible and to the public immediately. And it's equitable to all the readers of that article, but not necessarily the researchers. And so for researchers who don't have grants, for researchers who might be at resource poor institutions or in the developing world, they can't access the ability to publish except as a charity. And so there's also a middle model, a hybrid model, which some of our classic journals like the Crop Science journal publishes under, and that allows authors to publish either under model one where the reader pays or model two where the author pays, and both articles can live side by side each other in the same journal. Now, the reason that I am really concerned with the direction of publishing is based on my time as a senior advisor in the office of the chief scientist in USDA, where I was in DC, and that was right about the time that there was a big push for FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. In 2013, there was an executive order from the Obama White House requiring all government information to be made open and publicly available. And this has been interpreted in various ways by various groups. The Trump administration continued this, and the Biden administration has as well. As late as 2020, the Office of Science and Technology Policy was requesting information and seemed very concerned that they would like all publications, at least, if not all data, to be publicly accessible very quickly. And so for a scientific society like the Crop Science Society of America or the Soil Science Society or even the American Society of Plant Biology, this would be very disruptive to the model we use to support our activities like sending students to go learn about Washington, D.C., or providing stakeholders with information about climate change. Okay, and so we use the publication fees in scientific societies to facilitate things that benefit our members and society as a whole. And so if the federal government immediately said that all articles need to be open access and there weren't those charges, this could be very disruptive. So that's why I'm really concerned about this. I know a lot of my colleagues don't publish open access articles because they don't want to pay for them. And so there is a little bit of a disconnect. Now, with the National Institutes of Health, they're pretty aggressive at this. And when you write a grant, you need to say how you're going to make that information publicly accessible in a very defined timeline. With United States Department of Agriculture, it's a little more flexible. And there's a lot of people who are funded by USDA grants that don't make their publications immediately open access. So beyond federal mandates, why is this a concern? Well, we've seen a number of institutions, notably the California system, having an argument with one of the major journal publishers. And you can see over time, and this is from a Vox article, that the expenditures on journals increased by 520% over approximately 2 decades, whereas the consumer price index increased by 118%. So journals were, libraries were not able to afford the publications that are needed to continue science. So I spent a lot of time putting this together. It really primarily affects the areas that I focus on and publish on, with a couple of the really big journals at the top here. It's organized by impact factor, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about how impact factor is not a great metric. It's a pretty poor metric, but it's still one that some people like to rely on, unfortunately. So it is organized in that way, with Nature and Science being above the 60s in terms of impact factor. And we talk about Cell, Nature, Science being CNS publications, right, the big 3. And PNAS, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, over here at 12.7. And then there's an open access fee. So Nature, for instance, is a hybrid journal. And so you can publish at no cost if your article is accepted. Can publish at no cost under the Model 1 system, or if you want to make it open access so anybody can read it, those fees are now $11,500, almost $12,000 US dollars to publish in Nature. Science, I wasn't really clear. I spent a long time looking. I probably need to ask them what their open access fee is. But even if you're publishing under the author doesn't pay model, you still have to pay a certain amount for a figure. And then we can go down the rest of this list. Those colors that are in dark green are from my scientific societies, American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, or Soil Science Society of America, who we now use Wiley as a distributor for. Those in lighter green are from other scientific societies. Okay. Those in very light green are from other nonprofit scientific publishers, notably PLOS and PeerJ. Those in yellow are from for-profit publishers, but those that are generally recognized as being, recognized by the community as not a problem necessarily. And those in red, notably Springer and Elsevier, are pretty much, disliked by most of the scientific the scientific community for the for-profit model that they have. So we can see here that there's a lot of hybrid journals, and I may have made some mistakes here, because this is an OA journal, but it really is a hybrid journal, and it's $0 if you want to publish theoretical applied genetics, and then if you want to make it open access, it's over $4,000. Now, when I look at where the good values are, if we look at the plant genome, for instance, it has an impact factor of 4.2. If that's your metric of quality, again, not my metric of quality, but this is about know your audience, right? And so the open access fee on this is a little over $2,000 plus a page fee. We also have PLOS One here, and PLOS One is one of my favorite journals, especially in terms of value. $1,800 to publish an open access article, and it's pretty widely read and accepted. And then went down to the bottom here, we have something like the Journal of Plant Registrations, which only releases articles that are plant variety releases. So those tend to not get cited very highly, low impact factor, but also, lower cost. So I'll post this with the video and make this accessible, but you can look this up yourself and do the math for whatever your discipline is. Now, what really struck me as I look at the history of open access publishing is this 2013 article and the cost of open access. And these costs have increased dramatically over the last 9 years. And when we look at what the breakdown is of what they're actually charging for, I don't know that it's really justified that the cost of open access has increased all that much. I mean, the actual activities that are related with formatting the article, labor has gone up a little bit, but making the article available in perpetuity, I don't know that really has gone up. So I put it out there on Twitter and just said, what is the main barrier for people publishing open access in my scientific society? And what I heard over and over again was cost, especially among foreign scholars. Foreign scholars, it's a lot of money to come up with, especially if it's a US dollar, cost for publication. And then, I also had 1 month where this was just some of my credit card bills from open access publishing. I think that month I ended up having $8,000 to $10,000 in open access fees to make my articles available. And my students said, that's crazy. Most of my colleagues aren't publishing in open access. You shouldn't pay that. But then again, if we look at what the federal mandates are, if you're doing work funded by the federal government in the United States or in Europe, you are sort of under a mandate that you're supposed to do that. So just because it's not enforced doesn't mean that it's not, doesn't mean that it's legal. Just put it that way. So when we look at the big for-profit publishers and even a couple others that I was able to dig into the money with, and these are all, for the most part, estimates, and we could argue and debate about these. But Wiley has ended up, helping my scientific society make our articles available, and they are one of the big, 800-pound gorillas that can also increase the reach of our articles. So that's a good thing. They've had about $2 billion in revenue. They make about 10% of profit off that, and they are a publicly traded company. So you can buy stock in John Wiley and Sons. Now, if we contrast that with something like Springer Nature, and this number is definitely under debate. I've seen estimates from 0.75 billion to 7.5 billion, and I don't know the true answer. But the estimate that I saw was about 22.8% profit, and this is a privately held company. Now, if we compare that to Oxford, and the Genetics Society of America uses Oxford to make their journals, the way Crop Science does with Wiley, make their journals available. They have about 0.75 billion pounds and make about 7% profit, 56 million. Now that profit they plow back into the Oxford University and other charitable things. So, when you are publishing with a publisher like this, they are making, some money that's not directly related to their actual costs, but at least that mostly goes to charitable activities that advance the discipline or the science or something like that. Now, if we look at probably the least liked of all the publishers, Elsevier, they have over $2 billion in revenue. They make 36.8% profit. So that is about the most profitable business that is, known to man. That's profitable than almost any sector of the economy. So they're, a publicly traded company. So people are profiting off the science that we do in our article publications to sort of an exorbitant extent. So when we discussed earlier about the cost of these articles, right, and where that money goes, some of it goes to typesetting and labor, like I mentioned, but some of it goes to profit. And, I think I can make a strong argument that, 33%, 36% profit is an exorbitant amount for scientists who are mainly doing the labor for free. So let's take a quick step into predatory journals. I'm assuming most people know this, but I found a number of people don't. So a predatory journal exists mainly to charge publication fees. They're all open access or theoretically open access, and they are publishers ready to publish any article for payment. So that means to get that done, they pretty much have either no peer review or weak peer review. And there's been a number of people who've submitted fake articles, most notably in 2010, where computer generated nonsense was actually accepted for publication in one of these predatory journals. They also often have fake editorial boards or no bar for editors. So there was an experiment done where somebody made up a fake profile of a scholar who had no publications and no editorial experience. And when they submitted to some of these predatory journals, a number of them accepted that scholar as an editor of the journal, right? So at least for the Crop Science Society, which I can speak to, it's very prestigious to be on the editorial board, to be selected as an assistant editor, let alone an associate editor or the editor-in-chief. We wouldn't often, or ever, I hope, just accept somebody who has no experience whatsoever. So there is a little bit of gatekeeping there, but the idea is it helps keep the quality up. So often these are based overseas. India and China are some of the main perpetrators, but you'll find they often have US or UK offices so that it looks like they're in a country that has, and they'll keep names similar to reputable publishers to keep that sort of facade up. And so it's estimated that there's over 1,000 predatory journals at this point. And the problem with this, if we think about this need for scholars, to have equitable access to publishing, it's often inexpensive for people to publish in these journals. So I could imagine if you were a scholar who didn't have very much money and didn't know about predatory journals, it would be an attractive option. And so this is really concerning for those of us who are in the nonprofit scientific publishing realm, that we might be missing out on some good quality articles because somebody didn't have the funds to do so. And I didn't mention, but we do have waivers to help people publish in these journals who might not have resources to do so. Not the predatory journals, the scientific society ones. You might check out Beale's list. Jeffrey Beale, a librarian, was the original one to put together this list of predatory journals, and has gotten into some trouble for it because obviously he's disrupting their business model, which is taking advantage of unknowing scholars. I think PeerJ, I've never published in PeerJ, but when I look at PeerJ, I was really impressed at sort of their concepts and their ideas. They are a not-for-profit. I believe some of the founders left PLOS, which was also is a not-for-profit publisher, and they do open access. They also have some things like this membership, so you can buy a membership so that you can publish a number of articles a year with them. And then they also offer some other services to help. These things are a business. You do have to commit to making your articles available to people in perpetuity to be a reputable journal. And so they have things like making a graphical abstract or a video abstract that are a nice add-on. Now I want to talk about impact factors, because I think impact factors, unfortunately, are way overemphasized and don't really reflect quality or anything of value, other than how our administrators or decision makers might perceive our work. So this is just an example of looking at a journal impact factor here. So our crop science has high trust in publishing. So that's one of the benefits. I often hear our members say that they feel like crop science should have a much higher impact factor because the review process is very rigorous, and it's pretty difficult to fix your article to get published in crop science. Whereas for some other journals, which may have higher impact factors, the review process is pretty lax. So the impact factor doesn't really reflect the actual rigorousness of the science. And unfortunately, when you look, it now looks like Wiley owns the Crop Science Journal, when really it's still a not-for-profit scientific society. We use Wiley to distribute and actually make that information available, but the scientific society still has complete control, editorial control, owns the rights, all of that stuff. And so that's been unfortunate how some of my colleagues I found in Europe think that it's a Wiley journal when really it's part of a scientific society. And I think there is a really big difference with what happens with the funds that you pay for this. So how are journal impact factors calculated? It's really quite simple. This is just one example. So it's the number of citations to the journal in the past 2 years divided by the total number of citable items in that journal. So when we talk in our scientific societies about how to increase impact factors, the easiest thing is just reduce the number of articles, right? So just be more rigorous, reject a lot more. We want to be exclusive and reject as many as possible. But for a scientific society, that works against what we're trying to do, which is make our members' science available more broadly. And so if we have graduate students who may have done excellent work, work that moves science forward, but not earth-shattering in terms of excitement, we still want them to be able to publish in our scientific society journals. And so that's part of the reason that we have a lower impact factor of the scientific society journals, in my opinion, than some of the for-profit publishers who really focus on increasing impact factor. And they do that by being gatekeepers and saying what's good science or what's exciting science and what's not. I'm a little concerned that there are some, you can increase the impact factor by citing your own work. And so you can do that in a way that's abusive, but you can also do that in a way, or you can also have to do that. So if I think about my work, I'm one of only 2 corn breeders in the state of Texas and one of only a few public corn breeders left. There's not going to be a lot of people citing my work. So most of the citations I'm going to get are myself building on work I did previously, right? And so some of these new measures of self-citations, which are good in theory, may actually really hurt some of the smaller disciplines and some of the niche disciplines. And it's no reflection on the science that's done. So John Ioannidis, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, has really done some tremendous work. He's actually one of the most highly cited scholars of all time. He's at Stanford. He talks about how to inflate and manipulate impact factors of journals. And at the start of the article, it says, the journal impact factor is without a doubt the most widely used, misused, and abused bibliometric index in academic science. Journals are ranked within their field based on journal impact factor, right? So obviously this is a concern, and we can talk a little bit about why we care about impact factors. But first, let's talk why impact factors are used. But first, let's talk about the purpose of scientific scholarship and peer review. Okay, so the purpose of scientific scholarship is really to share our scientists' work and the science so that other people can benefit from it. And those other people might be other scientists who want to build on what you found. It might be industry or policymakers, or it might be the public who's just got curiosity about some fundamental process. The other purpose is it allows other people to replicate and confirm our results by making it publicly available. It's supposed to be a transparent and fair process for determining the best science. And I think we have some questions on whether or not that's always the case. But in an ideal situation, that's part of the process. But the main reason people publish is for career advancement, if we're being honest. So personal accomplishment is great. It's always great to get a publication accepted. It's a great feeling. It's also important for showing that you're relevant in your discipline. And so citations do that. People citing your work and saying that it's been valuable for them or building on it. But really, it often comes down to money and power, as most things do. So granting agency decisions are, at least the review panels are, in my experience, somewhat to often based on publishing. If you don't publish from previous funding, you're not going to get additional funding. Jobs. So, you're not going to get a faculty job if you don't have a number of peer-reviewed publications, right? And you're not going to be able to advance in your faculty job through promotion and tenure or get salary increases if you don't continue to publish peer-reviewed publications. Major awards, same thing. It's pretty hard to get a Nobel Prize or be in the National Academy of Sciences if you're not unless you're a prolific publisher of high impact work, not impact factor, but high impact work that other people cite and use and changes science and society. And then, a huge factor here is university metrics and rankings. So university metrics, at least some of them, are based on where faculty in their university publish and how their work is perceived. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other reasons, but this is sort of the basis of why we have scientific scholarship and peer review. But there's a number of problems with this. So I've already mentioned, costs and who pays. We have a large problem with equity in this, and a large problem with gatekeeping. Also, access to publicly funded work. If I, as a taxpayer, am funding a bunch of research, shouldn't I, as a taxpayer, also be able to access that work, right? And it's a good question, but as often the answer is much more complicated, and why it's not so simple. I'm seeing a lot of folks who are really concerned about the imperfections of peer review, and I fully agree. So I've been an editor of 3 journals. I was a founder and the editor of one journal, and I've seen how we can get very different quality of peer review from people we send out articles to. Oddly enough, the best quality of peer review is typically early career, like late stage graduate students and postdocs, because they tend to be most invested in the science, most knowledgeable of what's going on. And I usually find that some of the worst peer reviews are done by senior faculty who are somewhat out of touch and are also always strapped for time. So peer review is imperfect for reproducibility. You can look up articles on the reproducibility crisis. There's some estimates that 70% of science cannot be reproduced, especially in the social sciences. And how do we evaluate impact from that? So having two reviewers and an editor, can they review the science, but also can they review how important that science is likely to be, especially if it's cutting edge science moving in a new direction. Another problem that a lot of people discuss is how this is a for-profit system. And I showed you some of the profits, some of the exorbitant profits that some of the publishers make. It's a for-profit system that's really based on free labor. So reviewer labor is one of them. I, as a reviewer, I'm not typically paid. I, as an editor, at certain stages and for certain journals, may be paid. I, as a scientist, am never paid for submitting my work. In fact, as we just saw with open access, I usually have to pay. So why is it that other people who are not involved in any of these steps can therefore make an exorbitant amount of profit, right? And I think a lot of people are concerned about this. I don't have any answers. This is mainly for discussion. A limited amount of data can be shared. So in my program now, we're talking about 60 terabytes of data from the last few years of drone flights. And so if I'm really truly trying to make everything findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, trying to make that many terabytes of data is very, very expensive. So these rising costs are unsustainable with our current funding trajectory. We are seeing slight increases across all funding agencies, but you can't pay for all the new demands, especially making data available. And then, as I say over and over again, these costs are inequitable. Those from developing countries, or those who are at resource poor institutions, or maybe those who spend most of their career teaching and don't have the opportunity to focus on research or write grants, or choose not to, either way, to publish a finding is actually pretty expensive. There's also other issues with journal impact factors. I mean, I showed you before, it's a metric that we shouldn't put a lot of stock in. And increasingly, there's incentives for bad science. Some countries actually pay researchers based on how high the impact factor is of the journal they submit to. So if that's how you're compensated, then there is a perverted incentive for you to do whatever you can, ignore certain things, or even have some malintent in submitting some of these articles, right? And so these are all some problems with peer review. For better or worse, we're starting to see post-publication review. So if you look at a website like Retraction Watch or PubPeer, there are people who will go through articles, as you should. You hope other people are reading your articles. But when there's questions about the legitimacy or reproducibility, they question them there. And a number of people have been fired for misconduct based on manipulating figures or being deceptive or falsifying data. So as we think about the future of scientific publishing, peer review being a process of two peer reviewers and an editor is seeming increasingly, sketchy. And maybe the better court is the court of scientist opinions moving forward. Something to consider. Now, preprints is a major component of what I want to talk about here. And the bottom text is cut off, but I'm a big fan of preprints. I'm new to preprints. I have some colleagues who are much more experienced, but bioRxiv or SciArchive for the psychologists, or there's one for math and engineering out of Cold Spring, mostly out of Cold Spring Harbor, is one set of preprint servers. Really nice resource for people in the community. Really impressive how it's grown. It's nice because there's ultrametrics. So I'm just showing you one article we submitted to bioRxiv. You get altmetrics, which is how many people have tweeted about it. So if you think about how we're measuring impact, historically it's been based on citations because that's easy to measure And it seems like it's really useful. However, if somebody's tweeting about your work, maybe there's also a benefit to that. And so if we can capture that in these alt metrics, as they call them in our library system, that's beneficial. So the amount of time that goes into submitting a preprint is actually really low compared to a scientific society article or a scientific journal article, peer-reviewed scientific journal article. Most people think you write an article and you're done. And then my grad students are usually quite disappointed to realize that they have pages and pages of forms to fill out before they submit, and they got to reformat their figures and all this complicated sort of formatting and bureaucracy. Whereas with a preprint, you don't have to do a lot of that. It does get a digital object identifier, or DOI, which does make it available for citations. It has alt metrics, as I mentioned. One of the huge benefits is if you put something on a preprint, it's sort of like putting a stake in the ground and saying, we did this first. So in really hot areas where there's concern about somebody scooping and publishing before you, it eliminates that process of peer review, which can be different from article to article, journal to journal, editor to editor. I'm a pretty bad editor. So for me, it might take 3 to 6 months to get an article through. I've had an article that an editor took 2 years to get through. If somebody else had submitted something at the same time to an editor who was faster and a journal that was faster, it would look like they published the work 2 years before we did. So that's a big concern and one of the benefits of these preprints. Now, it's not peer reviewed, and it says that this article is a preprint and has not been certified by peer review, right? But as we discussed, as 2 reviewers and an editor of inequality, is that certification, does that make it any more legitimate? Well, the pub peer and the pub peer and Retraction Watch would say no, but we still believe in the peer review process. So it's not peer reviewed, but it is nearly indistinguishable to the public. So if I put out on Twitter a bioarchive thing that's completely made up, most people in the lay public are not going to be able to differentiate that from a quality scientific publication. So Google Scholar, which has become what most people report their citation metrics, actually does recognize things in bioarchive and some other preprint servers. So if the cost is that low, the time is that low, and you can get cited in bioarchive or another preprint server, that's going to really challenge the model of peer-reviewed publishing. And the point that got cut off here for that, when I've discussed this before, people are unclear about, the whole point of a preprint server is you're putting it there while it's submitted for publication. What we're starting to see is that sometimes people put articles onto a preprint server and then not submit them for publication. And so that's a whole different line of thinking. But maybe we can discuss that a little bit later. So I looked because I was asked this question, and I found no instance of a bioarchive article cited in a Soil Science Society of America journal. But I did find, as I looked at a bioarchive article, I did find an article, the second article I looked at, that was cited by a number of, pretty respected journals: Plant Biotechnology Journal, Plant Journal, Industrial Crops and Products, Agronomy, all cited this bioarchive article. So this bioarchive article was not peer-reviewed, but yet peer-reviewed articles did cite it because they found value in it, right? But it also gives this an air of legitimacy, even though it didn't undergo peer review. So that is something to consider. Now, when I looked at Crop Science Society of America journals, I found it interesting that the only journal in the Crop Science Society of America family that cited a bioarchive journal was the Plant Genome, which is the highest impact journal that we have in the Crop Science Society of America. But it's published only 2 articles that use a bioarchive article in the reference list. So it's not a huge thing right now. It may be that the editors told them they had to take that out. I don't know. But it is interesting that these bioarchive articles are getting cited. Now, in the tri-societies, that's Crop Science Society of America, the American Society of Agronomy, and the Soil Science Society of America, we have our own preprint server. It's through Wiley, and our the managing editor is on the board of ESOR, the Earth and Space Science Open Archives. So this is very much like bioRxiv, but there are some big differences. So one thing that's different is that there's no alt metrics, so we can't see if it's being used. And another thing that's really different is there's no Google Scholar citation report. So Google Scholar is not indexing this. Now, the reason that matters is because this is a preprint server from a for-profit journal, right? Remember, Wiley is a publicly traded company, whereas bioRxiv is associated with an institution that does not, benefit or lose out from the traditional publishing system being disrupted. And so I would think, I don't know this, but if I'm going to anticipate, if I was a for-profit publisher, I would be really concerned about these preprints somewhat undermining our business model. And I can't help but wonder if that's not part of the reason that we don't see these, the same aggressiveness of the Wiley preprint server as we do from the Cold Spring Harbor preprint server. I will say they were very good about working with the North American Plant Phenotyping Network because some of the engineers and math folks actually use sort of abstracts, are almost as, are counted more highly or almost as highly as peer-reviewed publications. And so they were working with us to try something, quite innovative in taking a scientific society meeting and putting all those abstracts in a preprint. And then that could both be published or can be made available in the preprint server. So that was sort of impressive. I'd like to see how that moves forward. Now, so talking to some people, about this, I've heard that preprints are a phase or, not really a big deal. And then you look at this Fox article and these number of preprints over time, and you can see that preprints are a big deal and they're a growing deal. And there's something to consider, how they're going to change our future of scientific society publishing or scientific publishing. So, what does scholarly communication look like in the future? So historically, journal articles and books, and then abstracts and proceedings to a lesser extent in biology, but to a greater extent in engineering, computer science, and math, for example, are the main forms of scholarly communication and what the tenure and promotion and jobs and funding decisions are all made based on. But I think there's an open question as to whether or not preprints are a type of scholarly communication that maybe stands alone, or videos, YouTube, getting your science across in that way. What about curriculum or blog posts? Medium, if you go to the Medium website, has a number of articles, or probably millions of articles, I would guess at this point, that are sort of like what you would see in any type of popular press magazine. Are those, is that greater or lesser than submitting it for peer review? What about podcasts? A lot of popular science podcasts. How about tweets or TikToks, right? So what does all this future scholarly communication look like? Well, I think for at least the foreseeable future, if any of these things are going to be considered, they're going to need to be peer reviewed in some sort. And then they're going to need to be recognized by P&T committees. And P&T committees to date really are still just looking for these big three. And I would really say the first one, depending on your discipline, and maybe the second two in some other disciplines. And then lastly, it really needs to be recognized by universities, as well as by those organizations like US News and World Report that rank universities, because that's part of the currency of the university system. So I hope this was helpful. I look forward to any comments or discussion that might have in the chat, or please feel free to correct me if I got any facts wrong here, and I'd love to discuss that and keep the conversation going. So thank you.